Representative Jason Monks from District 22, Seat B, is also the Republican House Majority Leader in the House of Representatives, and it's my pleasure to talk to him today. So, without further ado, Representative Monks, you know, what's your story? What's your journey that brought you to this place where you are today?
You know, um, if you want an hour long story, I'll tell you my whole journey, but I'll try to condense it down to at least what kind of what brought me here. You know, I worked construction to get myself through high school and through college, and did that, and then I graduated with a degree from Brigham Young University. I started working in the semiconductor industry. My first job was at a semiconductor in Utah, actually. That After I was there for about a few months after I started full time, they announced they were going to close down the plant. And I stayed on for a little bit longer because my background is environmental health and safety aspect of working in a semiconductor. I did a small job at small period of time at a Superfund cleanup site there, and then came over to work at Zilog, which used to be in Nampa, Idaho, which is a semiconductor manufacturer similar to Micron. And I was there for about 10 years. And when they closed down, I was the environmental health and safety manager. But two of those jobs ended up shipping everything overseas. And that obviously is frustrating to be, working in a new industry and have everything shipped overseas to someplace else. And that was frustrating. So I kind of saw firsthand what overregulation did to businesses. In the environmental compliance world of a semiconductor, I really saw firsthand what can drive businesses out of the States. And that's concerning. And after I had closed down my second semiconductor manufacturer, I started a small business. And my wife and I run a couple small businesses here, and I still am running a small business today. And so I've got a pretty good background in the business world and what it takes to be successful in that way. And I have taken those background and experiences and applied them to how to have proper governance. And I think that's got me to where I think I do a pretty good job of representing the people of Idaho to make sure that Idaho is a successful state and we don't end up shipping everything overseas. Like I saw firsthand what happened when you do that.
Is that what inspired you to run for office in the first place?
I think it was more of just encouraged by friends who were more involved in politics at the time. I always prided myself on being involved and up to date, but more on the national level than I did on the local levels. And I had some friends who were more interested in the local side, and they encouraged me to run. And I really hadn't given it much thought. It wasn't ever a lifelong ambition to be in politics. It was more of just an opportunity came up. I took advantage of it. And frankly, I've really enjoyed having a say and influence over policies in which the state goes. And so I've been happy with that experiences.
So, since I have you here, this is a unique opportunity, being in leadership, the majority leader, but also having been elected to that position in the middle of a session. And for me, watching the legislature, I learn more and more, each year, each day, really. And, that position, it's your job to keep things running, get the bills to the floor, keep them moving, keep everyone on task. I'm sure it must feel like herding cats at times, but especially coming in right in the middle of a session. What was that like, and how do you manage that job when you have 69 other legislators and you got to keep moving forward?
Herding cats is probably the best analogy you have there. I had served in leadership 4 years previous as the assistant majority leader. Not the same job, but I was there. So I had an understanding of what the role of leadership was. And coming into the middle of session, obviously that was a little bit trickier as well. I was still the chairman of revenue and taxation for a number of weeks while I was the majority leader. And towards the end of session, we had a need in the Ways and Means Committee for a chairman to step in because of our other chairman had to take some personal time for some health issues. And so I ran the chairmanship of that one for the last several weeks of session. And so I kind of was doubled up on duties the entire year, it felt like. Um, but that's just part of the game. That's what I signed up for. And for the most part, we've got really good legislators there, and so it's not hard to herd the cats, if you want to use that example. But for the most part, we all want the same thing. We all want a better Idaho. It's just a matter of we disagree sometimes on what is a better Idaho and how do we get there. And so you just have to build consensus. The job title is the majority leader. That's what I am. And so I am trying to lead the majority of the Republican caucus and to find solutions that are better for Idaho and good for Idaho and get things done. I think in the long run, if you look at this last session, we did a really good job of what we accomplished. We didn't get everything accomplished that we wanted, but I think we got a lot accomplished. It was a good year, and I'm proud that I was part of it. And it was a great session.
One thing I've been thinking about the last couple of years, really, and had conversations with others, is our current setup with part-time legislators, legislative session going about 3 months. Do you think that's still working? I can see an argument for making it longer or for paying legislators more so that you can get people who are tied to a 9 to 5 job in. But also, you don't want to take away from the whole citizen part-time legislature environment. So what do you see the status, and should it be changed, or are we good?
Uh, Great question. I don't know the right answer to that. There's benefits for us being a part-time legislature. You don't want full-time politicians running the state. There's inherent hazards with that. And then you say, however, the fact that we are a part-time legislature means that we don't have really the time to get a lot of things done. Sometimes it takes years to get a specific bill through. I remember working on the sales tax distribution formula for the cities, and that took me about 4 years to get it complete. And knowing that we have a 2-year term, we're cycling through people every 2 years, and sometimes we start over. Just this last legislative term there, when we had the redistricting, we put 31 new people into the House of Representatives out of 70. That's a big turnover. The 10 years prior to that, we put in 30. And
Wow.
so when you do that, you're starting over sometimes with a learning curve. We're only there for 3 months out of the year. Just trying to find out how agencies do things takes time. If you can imagine, you start a new job and 3 months later you're done. That's one session, and we're still just trying to figure out. I say where the bodies are buried. It's obviously not literal, but how agencies work, where the problems are. And of course, nobody's going to come up and say, hey, this is the problem. You need to fix this. A lot of times we have to dig in, and it takes years before you can at least figure out what you're doing and how to be effective at solving some of those problems. So you got a plus and a minus on as far as, do you want us there longer or do you not? And I can see it makes it very difficult being in there short period of times. But by the same token, I don't want a professional politician class in Idaho either. And so I like the fact that we're a part-time legislature. I think we should keep it there. Does that prohibit people from serving that are 9 to 5 employees? Absolutely, it does. And so again, we lose out on their expertise as well. I'm fortunate that I own my own businesses, that I can rely on my really good employees to keep things running while I'm at the Capitol.
Yeah. Also, the current system, it kind of puts you at a disadvantage with the executive branch because they're obviously year round. They've got staff. We send citizen legislators in, and you have hundreds of bills to consider, hundreds of budgets. They're all very complex. And of course, you have people on all sides telling you how you should feel or what you should believe, how you should vote. Uh, how do you maintain grounding in that environment?
Uh, Very difficult. You mentioned the agencies, and they're there. And I'll channel a little bit of a former senator that served for a lot of years, Bart Davis. And I remember sitting on an interim committee with him, and we were looking at the foster care system and trying to find out all the problems that are existing and how we could solve these. And he made a great analogy. He said he felt like he was one of Muhammad Ali's opponents. And I was trying to figure out, I looked at him like, what do you mean? And he said, well, you know, that Muhammad Ali, when he boxed, he'd just go sit, sometimes he'd just kind of curl up in the corner, he'd cover up, and he'd let you kind of pound out for a while until you got tired. And then he picked you apart afterwards because you were all punched out. And Bart Davis said, I feel like you're just pulling a Muhammad Ali, the rope-a-dope, where you just go curl up in the corner. We're tiring ourselves out. We're asking all these questions. You give us the answers we want to hear. And then as soon as we're all done and tired and moved on, you're going to still just do whatever you want. And I thought that was an interesting analogy. And to an extent, I think there's some truth to that. I'm not trying to castigate all, state employees
Sure.
that they're all bad. I'm not saying that, but nobody likes somebody else playing in their sandbox. And when we come to town and we start looking into agencies and how things are done and their budgets, we're playing in their sandbox. And of course they don't like that. Nobody would. And as a part-time legislature, it is hard. And the lobbyists, the same thing. The argument for term limits here within the state itself, federally, totally different issue. I think that's a complete different issue. But here within the state, people talk about that term limits. And I say, well, first of all, let's look at our turnover rate. And every 10 years, we turn over almost half of the entire people. That's pretty much term limits happening all the time. Our term are only 2 years anyway. It's not like 6 years with the Senate in the federal government. And the people who really will gain more power and authority if we implemented something like that here in locally is the lobbyists and the bureaucrats. They will be the ones who truly run the world because it just takes too long for us to figure out how to be effective and what to change, not just necessarily how to change it, but even what to change.
Yeah. Well, I know one of the big issues this year was the new JFAC budgets. That obviously caused a lot of debate, which as it should. Do you think the new system is going to make it easier for the committees and for the chambers to take a closer look at some of the agencies and what they're requesting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good system. Obviously, making any change is going to take time. There's a lot of bugs to work out. The question was, were these truly all just maintenance budgets that we passed at first? You could argue yes and no. There were some things that needed to have been in them that weren't in them. But it definitely puts a spotlight on any additional funding requests going forward. And that is really good. JFAC's job, I spent a couple of years on JFAC, is to spend all the money. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek because they kind of get offended when you say, you just spend all the money. And I say, okay, your job is to appropriate all the money. And then they're going, oh yeah, that's what we're supposed to do. So regardless of how much, programs we put in place to put spotlights on those budgets, we're still going to appropriate all of that money. That's why I've come to the conclusion that I think we are better off to control the faucet going in as opposed to where it's going down the drain or out. That's why our tax policies are critical, that we have low taxes to make sure that we have the bare minimum amount of money coming into the government to fund the services that we need without overfunding them, because it's going to create a problem that way. And so it's important that we look at not just JFAC. We always look at JFAC as the health of the state when it comes to spending. But really, the tax policy on the front end determines how much they have to deal with to begin with. And I think that's a real focus that we need to do. But no, I'm glad the new process is taking place. I think it'll be tweaked quite a bit over the next few years if we can continue to go down that route. And I think that's a good thing. I think most of the consternation that people had or concerns was because they were going to have a spotlight put on the the list of things that they could normally kind of, I don't want to say sneak in, but the things that they could get included in their budget without as much, um, review, because now it's not a take it or leave it budget. That's the difference. Right now, we're going to pass the minimum. Here's the minimum everybody gets at the beginning of session. You want extra, then let's look at those individually. And so that's a really good way of budgeting, as opposed to having a standalone budget for one agency, and either you fund education, which means you fund all of the extra line items with it, or you don't. And now I'm going to catch 22. If I vote against that budget, then it's going to be claimed that I don't support education and that I had against the budget. And so this way, it's a lot better. I'm really excited about how it's going to go moving forward.
Well, it's really interesting how you explained focusing on tax policy to control how much comes into the system rather than focusing all your energies on where it goes once it's in there. I've noticed that you've spent a lot of time on tax policy the last couple of years that I've been paying attention. Uh, you know, what more do you see that the legislature can do? I know property taxes are still a big issue that people complain about. People talk about grocery taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, everything else. What else would you like to see done to reform the tax system?
Oh, wow. If I could do everything in one fell swoop, there's a lot. I mean, let's look at our income tax. Income tax, we've been able to get that down to 5.695 is in effect this year, actually. So your next year's taxes, that will be your reduction there. We didn't take a ton of it off this year. We've been able to kind of, on the income tax, it's a slow process, but we took another 10th off. That's good. When I started, I believe we were in the mid sevens. And so if you look at where we started and where we're at now, that's a big deal. And we need to be less on that. Anytime the state has extra money at the end of the year, then we're taxing too much. So that's just kind of, in my mind, a logical thing. So I'm one of these guys that will cut taxes anytime, any place, anywhere, if possible. So income tax, I would like to continue to see us to take little small bites of that every year if we can, to get us down to a point. I'd love to see us down around 5% is I think a good reasonable number. As far as sales tax, I'm actually a big fan of sales tax. I think that's the fairest tax that we have. It's broad-based, it's low, and it's uniform. It's across the board, and everybody pays it. That I do like. If we could reduce that one a little bit too, I would be happy to do that. But I would rather see it on the income tax. Also on the property tax side, I think it's important for people to understand property tax is a local tax, meaning of all the taxes that we collect, not we as a state, but that are collected for property tax, about 30% goes to your cities, about 30% goes to the counties, and about 30% goes to the schools. Now that's averages across the state. It does fluctuate in certain communities. Some communities, the school portion can be almost up to 50%, but that's the averages. And then about 10% goes to those other taxing districts, libraries or cemetery districts or mosquito abatement, whatever they happen to be. And you notice none of that went to the state. So property taxes is not collected by the state. It's not spent by the state. So it's a local issue. But we were able to provide some state dollars to go towards tax relief for people on their property side. I've always thought that if we are going to do anything to property taxes, we should look at the school side of it. Our Constitution requires that the legislature fund a public education. It's one of the few things that we're required to do in the Constitution. And it's supposed to be uniform, it's supposed to be fair and free to the people. And if you look across the state, you look at the buildings that are out as far as the different high schools, you can look even just within one community and you can see differences between high schools within a community. And then if you compare those across the state, you can see a lot of variation that some kids will tell you, boy, it's not very fair. It's not very uniform. They have big, flat screen TVs lining their hallways, and we don't even have, regular TVs. And so I think if we are, as a state, are going to get into helping to subsidize the locals in property taxes, I've always thought that the schools is the place to do it. I've been successful the last 2 years with House Bill 292. and House Bill 521, which I sponsored and helped author both of those bills that have been able to reduce property taxes. I think last year we found it was about almost 20% on average across the state that we reduced property taxes because of the bill. And I've always thought it would be nice if we could put some more money into that program to where we as a state paid for all of the buildings across the state for our school needs. Meaning, if you're in Ada County and more people move here and you need another school, then the state provides the funding, we build the school. If you're in a community that's got an older school that needs repairs, needs a new roof, needs a new whatever, the state provides for that. Similar to what we do with our permanent building fund, where we provide money for state buildings across the state. Meaning, if there's a police state, ISP, Idaho State Police, needs a new building, the state, we pay for that. Same thing with higher ed, the state provides that. If we could get to that point, we could eliminate the need for locals to have to bond or levy for schools. That's 30% of your property taxes that could go away. And so that's my ultimate goal, is to try to get property tax almost at least reduced by a third by providing that through the schools. And so we've been successful at getting that a good start. I'd say we're about 2/3 of the way there. If we can get some more money into that program, we'll be able to save people even more on their property taxes. So yeah, tax policy, I'm all in for. Let's reduce anything and everything that we can along the way. I believe Milton Friedman said something to the effect of, I'm always open for cutting taxes, any kind of tax, anywhere, any amount. And I kind of adhere to that philosophy of, yeah, let's cut taxes.
You mentioned schools, and that's another big issue. There's been a debate over school choice. Obviously, we have school choice in that parents can send their children to public schools, charter schools, private schools, micro schools, or homeschools, or anything else. But there's a question: should somehow money follow those children? And obviously, the education savings account was defeated in the Senate last year, and this year there was a tax credit, but it didn't get out of committee. However, I remember you arguing, really well, in my opinion, for that bill, unfortunately, before it was defeated. What do you see as, I guess, what you would want to see as far as school choice, and what do you see as possible with the legislature?
Possible and what I want are obviously two different things. So I think what I would like to see is definitely just money following the kids. And even within the public schools, to an extent, the money doesn't always necessarily follow the kids the way I would like to see it. The state spends, depending on which numbers you want to look at it, $9,000, $10,000 per kid that's spent on each child. And if a child moves from a public school to a charter school, that money does not follow that child. It stays within that district based on a lot of criteria. It is based on attendance. And so you could make the argument sometimes that does follow them, but not necessarily how you and I would think that, the money should follow the kids. I think that we do have a lot of choice here in Idaho, but we have a lot of choice within the public school system. That's your choice. So it's all within the public school system. You're still, through the public school system. If you go to Mountain View, or you go through to Meridian or Renaissance High School, at least that's, around where I live. It's still part of the same system. So I jokingly say, I love Taco Bell, and that's your options. You can get a taco, you can get a burrito, or you can even get some nachos. That's your public school system. And I'm not trying to disparage our public school system by saying it's Taco Bell, because I like Taco Bell, but Taco Bell doesn't work for everybody. Sometimes people would rather have a burger, they'd rather have a salad, they'd rather have just something different. And so it's crucial for people to have the option to go elsewhere, whether that's schooling at home, whether that's a pod that they're doing, or whether it's a private school. Not everybody can afford to do those options. Parents don't always have, especially if you've got two working parents, they can't homeschool. So what is their option? And their option is public school. And they can have their taco or their burrito or their enchilada, and that's it. I don't think it's fair to the kids that they don't have the same options that somebody who's wealthy has. Somebody's wealthy, they can afford to send their kid to a different school because they financially can do that. I don't think that your income should determine what kind of education that you get when it comes to K through 12. Again, K through 12, that is our constitutional responsibility. And so I am a firm supporter of making sure that money can be available to parents no matter how they choose to educate their children. The bill that you had mentioned was House Bill 447. I was one of the sponsors of that, helped draft that bill as well. And we thought maybe we had a path forward through the Revenue and Taxation Committee, but we obviously didn't get it out of that committee. One thing that I found most interesting during my research and discussion on school choice issues was that if you look across the country, and there's been over 180 some odd studies on choices outside of the public system, meaning through education savings accounts, through tax credits, through grants, allowing kids to go to private schools. Almost universally, those studies show that kids do better when they go to those other schools. Now, here's the most interesting thing. Studies also show that the kids who remain in public schools also do better. So we're getting better results for our kids, whether they stay or whether they go. That's what I'm about. I want better school results. I don't care whether or not how the funding works out. I care about the results for the kids. And so if you care about the results for the kids, then this is the system that will provide best results for the kids. And none of the criticism I heard was ever about this isn't going to provide a better education. All the criticism that we heard was, oh, you're going to steal the money or rob the money from our public schools and they're going to hurt. The bill did not do that. The bill did not take one penny from public school systems, but there was the perception that any money spent not on public schools was taking it from them. And I kind of reject that theory any more than money goes to health and welfare somehow takes money from education. We've funded education tremendously in the last 10 years since I've been there. The increase spending that we've done has just been really unprecedented. As well as even in the House Bill 521, the tax cut bill that we had done provided over $1 billion more for school facility needs this in 1 year. And so the idea that you can't do both, I think, is not a fair statement. I think you can do both. Just like when we started charter schools, there was a big upcry that charter schools were somehow going to destroy our public schools because all the kids would leave and we would underfund our public schools. And that hasn't been the case. It's actually been a wonderful thing. And anybody who looks at it objectively will say, yeah, of course, charter schools have increased the results that we're getting, whether it's inside or outside of the charter school world. So that's where I'm at. I like the options for parents. I think I would trust the parents in their decision making on what's best for their kids more so than I would for any other bureaucrat, teacher. I don't care how involved you are in those children's life. I think the parents ultimately have the best interest of their children in mind, and they're the ones who can make those decisions best.
Well, for sure, I agree with that. It seems that with any whether it's private sector or public sector organization or agency, there's always a circle the wagons approach, and I see that with the public school system. Whatever needs to be reformed or fixed in there, they circle the wagons and don't come to our system. We'll take care of it.
Yeah, to an extent, I think you're right. Again, it's that whole adage: nobody wants somebody else playing in their own sandbox,
Yeah.
and I think that's a little bit of it too. And again, my mother was a school teacher, public school teacher. I had a lot of great teachers myself. My kids have had a lot of great teachers. It's not an attempt to try to hurt or disrupt them. It's just about providing some additional options for parents. Not all kids work in a public school system. I've firsthand experienced that with my own children, that we've had to move them around to different locations to find what works best for them. And I think that's what's important, is that we provide parents with the options, and it shouldn't be dictated based on your zip code or your W-2 or your tax status on whether or not you can make the best choice for your child.
Speaking of zip codes, looking at a map of your district, District 22, it's mostly rectangular down south end of Boise and Meridian. Uh, some urban, some rural. It looks like it's growing fast, though, from what people tell me. I occasionally drive through that area. Uh, what's unique about your district? What are some of the unique challenges, and what are you hearing from your constituents out there as to what their biggest concerns are?
Um, it is, we've got a lot of constituents, and again, this was redistrict just 2 years ago, and so 22 looks different than it did for the last 10 years. But I think, I don't want to say completely unique. I think what exists in 22 exists in some parts of the state as well. We have a large number of people who are within a city's impact area, but live in the county. So not everybody in my district lives in a city, yet they are affected by the policies of that city, whether it's Meridian or whether it's Boise. I've talked to quite a few of my constituents in there. That's what they're concerned about. It's like I don't get a vote for the mayor of Boise, and yet I'm have to follow their guidelines when it comes to, I wanted to start a daycare, or I wanted to
Mm.
run a small business out of my place, and so they're affected by that, and they're quite concerned about that. I think another one of the issues that is affecting part of District 22 is water. And you wouldn't think of that because normally we think of water and we think of the agricultural, places across the state and where that affects us. But you've got some areas that are some older parts of the valley. People have put in wells because again, older homes in an area that was not serviced by a city, and so they had their own well. And what's happened across the state with less agricultural and more residential land is that we're no longer flooding the land when we grow our crops. And because of that, our aquifer is not getting replenished like it used to be. And if you add on top of that the New York Canal that runs through my district, that canal provides a lot of water, and a lot of water leaks from that aquifer down to from from the canal itself down into the aquifer. They're looking to reline that all that ductwork, and you can see why they would want to do that. It's their water, that water district that put in. The people own the rights to those waters, and they don't like the fact that they're losing a ton of water because it goes down just through all the cracks and all the imperfections in that canal. And the amount of water that leaks is huge. It's not a small amount. We're talking a huge portion of that water just leaks right down to the aquifer. Now that's good for the aquifer because it helps replenish that aquifer, but it's bad if you're paying for that water because you're losing so much of it. So when they go to reline that, it's going to cause a problem for all those people that have wells out there because they're going to start drying up. In fact, we've already seen some people in my district that have had their wells dry up. And that's a concern for us. And we need to have a plan in place. And I think as a state, we've done a really good job with our water in many applications. We've fought the federal government for control over that. We've come up with agreements and come up with good solutions. And I think we're going to have to roll up our sleeves again and to make sure that we've got good solutions over there, that we don't create more problems. But other than that, I think 22, we're growing pains. We got a lot of new people moving in here. We got a lot of new subdivisions, which means we need more infrastructure. We need more money for roads and schools. And those are kind of the suburban problems that District 22 has that we're dealing with. And I think we're trying to address most of those things. And I think we're coming up with some good solutions, and we will continue to do that.
The water issue you brought up is interesting. The first time I ever heard of uh, there being an issue with lining the canals and preventing leakage was probably more than 10 years ago, visiting an uncle who lives in rural Colorado. At the time, I lived in Western Washington, where our issue with water is what to do with all of it that falls from the sky. So it was a completely different, way of looking at things. And obviously that's something that's an issue throughout the state, I'd say, at least through the Treasure Valley. I know it's an issue up here in Eagle as well. Um, it brings to mind there's, you know, I guess a debate in the Republican Party about the role of government. Should it be completely limited to just protecting life, liberty, and property, or are there things that the government can and should do to facilitate, you know, our lives here? And I don't know. It's just been interesting hearing everybody's opinions on that, and I think it depends on where you come from. The needs of one region may not be the same needs as another. So, where do you see that, that line going? Are there things that the government should do as far as, say, facilitating water and at least, keeping an eye on the companies that manage those things that are necessary for us to live?
Um, so that's a great question, and I think I'm a firm believer in limited government, and I'd love to get us back to what government looked like in 1780. I would love to get there. I think in some aspects that ship has sailed a little bit. I mean, it's very difficult for us to rewind back to 1780, but there are things we should be vigilant on right now, make sure that we're not creating a bigger problem. I think where you have to is probably a too strong a word, where the need for government is usually in response to what the government has done. And for an example, in the healthcare industry, I'm a firm believer in capitalism. I think the free market always solves the problem, always. Sometimes it doesn't solve it as fast as we want, and that's when we get the government involved. But every time we get the government involved, we make it worse. And then it requires a government fix, which, if you put in a whole bunch of regulations on an industry, the only way that you're going to fix that is to have more regulation to get rid of that regulation. And we do that in healthcare. You look at our healthcare system right now, and it is a mess, and most of it is caused because of the government. So what do? We try to get out of it as much as we can. Now, again, water, you're talking, that's if you specifically want to talk about water, you're looking at a monopolistic system, similar to what we had to do with the railroads. Way back in the day, there was one game in town, it was one railroad, and they came up with the monopoly laws to address monopolies. And we do that with our Public Utilities Commission. Power, again, a problem. But you did see it, though, when we had the telephone system, when we deregulated that, when we had the big Ma Bell, and then we broke it all up. And I think ultimately we ended up with a better product when we got government kind of out of the way. So I think there's a place for government, but I think in general, without getting into specifics, if we can get the government out of the way, the solutions will come, and they're usually much better than what the government would have come up with to begin with. So I would love to see just free market solutions to just about everything. Again, on the water, with regards to, that's a little bit difficult, because who owns the water, right? That falls from the sky. Who owns the water that's underground? And do we allow everybody that wants to put a well in? And well, if you do that, then we're going to end up with a problem. I think Arizona, I read that the city of Phoenix downtown has shrunk by, I think, 3 or 4 inches in a certain period of time. And so the buildings are all sinking. And it's because the water table below, they're just sucking so much water out that it's a problem. So there has to be some responsibility associated with certain things. We can't just allow everybody to dig a well. Obviously, we'll all end up with no water if we do it that way. So I think there's a place for it. But in general, I think we need to get out of the way as opposed to try to legislate solutions to everything.
The thought of all the property owners digging wells and then sucking up all the water just made me think of Daniel Day-Lewis saying, I drink up your milkshake. Yeah, those common things. You obviously need some sort of neutral arbiter to come in and figure out how to manage those, and government can fit that bill for sure.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, ideally.
Ideally, that's a good statement.
One more thing on the role of government. I remember a bill early in the session that would have put some standards and thresholds on Medicaid expansion, and it failed in committee. But part of that reason it failed was because so many people, I was told hundreds of people signed up to testify against it because they were worried that they would lose their benefits. And obviously, once people become dependent on a government service, then it's hard to get rid of it, both from a political standpoint, because they're calling you up and saying, hey, don't vote against, or don't vote to get rid of this entitlement, but also just from a, logical standpoint, because they're dependent on it. So how do we roll that back? How do we create an off ramp so that the government pulls back from doing these things that were once done by families, communities, churches?
Great question. As you know, Medicaid expansion was voted on by the people here in Idaho, and they put it into place. The legislature had resisted doing that for years. Since I got in, that was an issue. Should we expand Medicaid? And it was never, we weren't going to do it. And the people got together and decided that they wanted that. We were also told a lot of things at that time, that it was only going to cost us about $40 million. And then ultimately the state would save a lot of money because of the federal match program associated with that. I believe last count I heard was somewhere around $400 million is what it's costing us. It is ballooning, and it's going to be a problem. If you really want to see what's going to affect whether or not we can build new roads and build new schools, it's going to be our Medicaid budget if it continues to expand and grow the way it is. So the attempt was to try to put a little bit more sideboards on it. We were told when that was being floated as an idea that it was for the working poor. And so it made sense to put sideboards on that says, well, if Medicaid expansion is for the working poor, then you have to be working to get it. I mean, that would make sense. But it's very difficult to roll back. I'll give you another small example of a rollback that I heard about this year in the legislature. The very first week that I had been voted in as majority leader, and so I went back to some of the leadership meetings that I was in before, but I hadn't been in a while. And I remember somebody bringing up, and they said, we need to have an extra $1 million. I think it was $1 million, maybe it was $500,000. I don't count me on that exact number, for Meals on Wheels. And I said, Meals on Wheels, why do we need to have more money this year? And they said, well, people are going to lose some benefits. I said, what benefits are we going to lose? So after some drilling down, I found out that during COVID, the federal government gave us extra money. So Meals on Wheels was a 5-day-a-week program, and individuals had a copay if they wanted to participate on it. So the federal government helped out for some of the elderly folks that needed food, and this was a program that they had. And they said, well, the COVID money's drying up. I said, well, so it was paid for before. What's the problem now? Well, we increased it from 5 days to 7 days, and we got rid of the copay. So now, if we don't have additional money, then people aren't going to get fed on those other days, and they're going to have to spend more money. And I said, so what lesson did we learn about taking COVID money? We don't expand programs, because when we do, we have to backfill them with state money. And that's exactly what ended up having to happen, because we took COVID money, we expanded a program, and then when the federal money dried up, we had to go back and add more state money. And so Medicaid is the exact same thing. We are expanding federal programs, and we're going to end up holding the bag when the dust settles, and when the federal government can no longer spend all this money. We're just having to backfill it. It's causing a problem, and it'll make a very big problem if we can't get some kind of sideboards on our Medicaid expansion here within the next few years, because it is just ballooning out of control.
Well, on that cheery note,
Sorry.
no, it's true. That's why we need, people in there who understand the gravity of the problem. I've appreciated your time. Thank you for making the time to talk with me. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything we didn't cover?
Well, Brian, I don't want to leave you on a bad note. I don't want you to think that it's doom and gloom here. Idaho has made some tremendous progress. If you look at how much we've been able to cut, I think I looked at some numbers over the last 4 years, I believe it was, since 2020. I believe we had looked at and added up all the various tax cuts to the people of Idaho, and I believe it was somewhere over $3.5 billion. And remember, our budgets a few years ago was only $2 billion. Now it's, I think, 5 or 6 billion. So it's a lot, but still, that's a huge amount of cut that we've done in taxes across the board. On top of that, we've been able to increase spending to those things that the people really want us to spend money on. People want us to spend money on good schools. They want us to spend money on infrastructure. And if you look at how much we've been able to increase the spending in those programs at the same time that we've cut taxes, you'll see that we're doing a really good job. And I think it goes to show that, yes, you can cut taxes. It stimulates growth. The state gets more money in the long run when you cut taxes. It's been proven, and that's a good thing. So we can cut taxes. We can get more money for those things that we need to do, building for roads and for schools, and cut taxes. And that makes me a happy camper, and it should make most Idahoans a happy camper as well. So don't think on doom and gloom. Look at all the success we've had, and I think we're going to have some more success as we continue to move forward.
Representative Jason Monks, House District 22, Seat B. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.